So thank you very much, and I'll say good afternoon to everyone, and I'll thank all of you for coming to this seminar. But special thanks to John Williams from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for joining us, and to the London School of Economics for hosting us, but also for helping to assemble what I think is a brilliant panel, so we're very pleased with that. Now you've heard who's on stage, but you also might like to know who all of you are. So I thought I would tell you. You are quite a mixture. You're academics, bankers, insurers, investors, regulators, policymakers, students, legal professionals, risk experts, diplomats, central bankers, researchers, economists, data scientists, behavioral scientists, among others. It's quite a melange. And I hope that you'll all contribute to our evolving thinking about organizational culture, because that's what we'll be hearing about today from a variety of perspectives. Now, culture has always mattered, of course, but it's in the spotlight just now, as we know, and it's a really critical factor, and I suspect that this focus will continue into the future. If we look through a lens at the collective values, principles, and beliefs that contribute to behavior in an organization, we begin to sense the culture of that organization. I think of it as being a bit like looking through a kaleidoscope, lots of different moving pieces, which we suddenly see with clarity and definition. But put the kaleidoscope down, come back to it later, those same moving pieces will make a different pattern, always a different pattern. There'll be a different view. Because culture, in some respects, can't be easily pinned down. It's shaped by the behaviors of the individuals in an organization. It's an organic construct. I'm delighted to have recently become chair of the BSB, which was set up as a non-statutory membership body to help promote high standards of behavior and competence across the UK banking industry. Having sat on the board since its inception in 2015, I believe the BSB is living proof that firms are taking up the challenge of understanding and managing their culture with increasing seriousness. We're also working more and more with firms outside the banking sector and outside the UK, others who've sought us out, having found out about our work, and have asked to engage with it. Indeed, one of the other organizations we've been really pleased to work with is the New York Fed, which took part in our assessment for the first time last year. In 2019, the BSB assessment reflected input from more than 81,000 employees across 29 UK banks and building societies. Its reach extended quite a bit further if we count those outside of banking who also participated. What we do is draw on the information from the assessment to build a picture of the extent to which individual firms and also firms collectively demonstrate a range of 9 characteristics that we would expect to be associated with good organizational culture. And I want to be clear that by good culture, we mean a culture that produces good outcomes for a firm's customers, clients, members, employees, the economy, and society as a whole. So where does behavioral science come in? For us, having established our assessment process in our first couple of years, we launched BSB Insights in 2018, bringing together behavioral scientists, data scientists, and policy analysts. Working with our member firms, they establish what good looks like and how to improve organizational culture. Their work focuses on identifying cultural or behavioral factors that enable, promote, or inhibit high standards in banking, as well as testing the effectiveness of new approaches and helping design improved environments at member firms. You'll hear more about some of this work. Specifically, you'll hear about an intervention to change speak-up culture from one of our panelists. So, huge progress for us in just a few years, but we're only just touching the surface of what can be tried and tested. This is a learning process for us and for our members, and of course not everything will work or it won't work quickly. That's why it's so important to hear and share with others from outside financial services, focusing on what can be brought to firms more widely by linking theory and practice, looking through the kaleidoscope again and again. Now, the New York Fed has been pioneering in its work in this space, leading by example, in part, as I've said, by running the BSB assessment themselves last year. So without further ado, I shall ask its president and CEO, John Williams, to speak to us before we turn to our panel of experts in behavioral science, management, law, and finance. John is a notable economist, a highly experienced central banker, a leader, and I think a visionary. John, over to you.
Thank you. It's terrific to be here, both for this panel, which I've been looking forward to for some months, but also to be back at the LSE. I did go for 1 year to the MSc here 30 years ago, which doesn't seem that long ago, but had just a remarkable experience studying here. Had great professors. I'll just name them off: Richard Laird, Chris Passeridis, George Evans, Charlie Bean, and the late Tony Atkinson. And they've inspired me, no question about it. They inspired me to pursue a career in economics and in public policy, which I followed since then. So this is a great institution. It's amazing to come back. I've been back a few times and seen the changes. I will tell you, anyone who's associated with the LSE, they are always asking for money. So that money is, I can see, being spent apparently on construction, as we saw this. But it's an institution that's grown and it's evolved with the times, I think, in a really good way. Now, there's a few things I will admit that I don't miss from my days in London. Some of them changed, some haven't. One is the food. The food 30 years ago was not the high point of living in London. That has changed for the better, obviously. The high cost of living, that hasn't changed. And I do still have some nightmares, although this is fading, from this whole British system of having exams at the very end of the year, where you have like an incredible amount of time to supposedly prepare for the exam. So that was a very trying thing to go through. But anyway, I miss things I do miss, obviously, my friends, visiting, studying here at the LSE, the bookshops and the library. Now, it's strange, a little bit ironic, actually, that the time I come back to LSE to talk, I'm not talking about economics, I'm not talking about monetary policy, and really it's about my role from my experience in management as a head of 2 organizations over the past decade. And one of the things you learn in senior leadership is that culture is both the hardest but also the most important thing to get right. It's at the heart of all of behaviors and norms, and it's the single most important factor that drives decision-making of employees throughout the organization. It's not an exaggeration that culture is critical, both when things go right and obviously when they go wrong. Now, before I get into deeper comments about culture, I should give the standard Fed disclaimer that I give in every speech. Everything I say reflects my own views and not necessarily anyone else in the FOMC or the Federal Reserve System. Okay. So there are certain policies that you do follow, and I guess that every time. So when we talk about company culture in the context of financial services, the first thing that comes to mind is the risky, unethical, and sometimes outright criminal behavior that's occurred in the banking industry, particularly during and following the financial crisis. Now, 10 years later, this behavior persists. Instances of fraud, money laundering, and scandals related to foreign exchange and LIBOR continue to make the headlines. And of course, this behavior has put a spotlight on the essential role of robust regulation and strict enforcement. But illicit and unethical behavior is rarely the result of an isolated bad apple. It's more often the symptom of a rotten culture, and rotten cultures don't appear overnight, nor for that matter do positive, inclusive ones where people feel empowered and accountable to holding up the values of their organization. So culture is created, intentionally or otherwise, by the structures, incentives, and behavioral norms that shape our working lives. So today I want to move the attention away from some of the extreme behavior that gets in the headlines and think more deeply about organizational cultures. So what's a good culture look like? How can leaders in the industry establish a positive culture within their firms? And perhaps most difficult of all, how do you ensure their firm's culture adapts to a changing world, but stays true to its underlying values and purpose? So I'm going to go through some examples. So consider this. A junior banker on a successful real estate investment team is asked to run projections for future rental income for a mall. As part of her research, she notices that the number that appears in the spreadsheet inflates future cash flows by, say, 4%. And then she asked her senior analyst if the numbers should be flagged as perhaps an unrealistic or overly optimistic assumption, because it's not based on the evidence. But the senior analyst responds by saying, well, there's a higher estimates that's actually relatively conservative, and really this is a judgment call. Let's come back and talk about this once we finish the project. So the project comes and goes, and everyone's busy, and this topic is never raised again. Now, this scenario raises a number of questions. Should you raise the question again, or did you get the message and nobody really wants to bring this up, and should you let it go? What was the senior analyst thinking when they said let's postpone this? And why did no one on the team really flag this as a ethical dilemma? So these are the kind of issues that people often face in everyday work environments. And this example is the way culture affects behavior, not just at the grand scheme of high-level issues, but really on a day-to-day basis. Now, employees generally come into an organization presumably with a pretty strong sense of right and wrong. What they may not realize is that the group norms can exert a powerful magnetic pull in their moral compass. So in this illustrative example, the junior banker knew the way the number was presented was unethical. And yet, in the end, she complied with the direction of her boss. The response from the senior analyst, saying this is a judgment call, is a common phenomenon. Using a euphemism to describe an inflated statistic camouflages the wrongdoing and makes it sound more acceptable to others. Now, we see this in our daily lives at work where people use phrases like troublemaker or you're not being a team player in order to shift the onus from the person whose behavior is being challenged to the challenger. So we think about how important it is when we carry out our work about how do we use language to disguise or excuse behavior that may be known to be unacceptable. Now, one of the issues that this example illustrates is how organizational norms affect our own sense of what's right and wrong and whether to speak up. Many of you will be familiar with the ASH experiment, where students participated in a vision test, and in this test there's a control line, and there are 3 other lines labeled A, B, and C, and you have to say aloud which line was the same length as the control. So that seems like a pretty straightforward test. Then they had to do so after a group of actors had given an incorrect answer. So about a third of the participants went along with the majority. So once you hear other people say, well, this is the answer, they went along with that, although it was obvious that that was not the right answer. When asked, why did you go along with the group when you knew that they were wrong? It says that the answer was probably not surprising. People want to fit in, or because they believe the group was perhaps better informed about something than they were. So does the junior banker drop the issue in an effort to fit in? Does she raise the question in private, or does she call a company hotline? The answer depends on the complex relationship between the individual and the culture in which they work. So I'm particularly looking forward to the panel from all the panelists. But Celia Morris, she spoke at the New York Fed last year. We had a conference on banking culture, and she discussed how organizations set goals and motivate people to achieve them. Praise, penalties, and rewards all influence an individual's behavior. Signals from the organization's leadership also have a major role to play. Do the echelons of management value echelons of management value divergent views? Do they foster a culture where people feel empowered to speak up? All these things shape how an individual will respond to an ethical dilemma, whether they'll acknowledge it as such, and how they'll lead others as they move up in the organization. As financial service professionals with great technical expertise, we often fall into the trap we can solve all of our problems on our own. I was commenting earlier to the panelists that one of the things you learn in studying economics is that economists know the answers to all questions. But in fact, we actually do have so much to learn from experts in other fields, and I think that's a real theme today and for the future. Now, one of the most important lessons I've learned as a CEO is that there's no fixed endpoint when it comes to shaping an organization's culture. This is not like a project where you say, we finished the culture project, we're done now let's focus our attention somewhere else. Culture is constantly evolving, it therefore needs to be constantly nurtured in the organization. And one of the most important challenging elements is that there's no clear benchmark for success. Sometimes your greatest strengths can become your blind spots. As an organization with a public mission and regulatory responsibility, the Federal Reserve needs to have a particular focus on compliance. But cultures with a heavy focus on compliance can develop a sense that individuals are no longer responsible for their actions. They're following the rules, but not actually being held responsible for their decisions. And then personally, as a CEO, I've learned to tackle these issues by focusing on the principles and values underlying the organization and the mission, rather than writing extensive policies that try to cover every potential situation. That puts a premium on individual decision-making, accountability, and doing what's right, and creating an environment where everyone has the ability and responsibility to speak up and express their views. Somewhat paradoxically, focusing on principled decision-making and accountability rather than relying on a lengthy rule book of policies and rules can be the most effective safeguard against wrongdoing and unethical behavior. So creating a positive work culture is a challenging and ongoing work. There's no silver bullet that can solve cultural problems overnight. And in terms of how to move forward, I'd like to make three brief comments before we turn over to the panel. First, I think that the fact that we're all sitting together in this room is a really important positive sign. That so many leaders from major firms are here together, engaged in these issues, is a symbol of how organizational culture is moving up the agenda. The second is the Banking Standards Board is a terrific tool for getting a snapshot of your organization's culture, what it looks like, and how it's changing over time. Having gone through this process ourselves last year, I think it was hugely valuable. We do a lot of engagement surveys for our employees. We do a lot of work on having a speaking up culture, but the assessment, I think, was illuminated a number of important issues. Helping us as leaders coalesce around the issues that we need to work on, and really helping provide a way forward. So I often describe to people, why did we do the survey or assessment that we're telling all the other banks that they should be doing, because I've said that publicly. It's really about eating your own cooking, making sure that what you are telling other people is the right thing to do. Well, obviously it's something you should do yourself. So I'd just also like to say that the BSB team are just really great people to work with on that. Now, it goes far beyond typical, like I said, typical engagement questionnaires, and it really, I think, does help us dig deeper into the culture which underlies all aspects of our organizations. And as it's kind of clear that without having that baseline understanding of what the culture really is like in all of its dimensions, without that, you really can't make progress. Now, the third is that when it comes to culture, I encourage everyone to look beyond their lens of expertise. Now, we at the Fed, of course, we're full of economists, lawyers, bank examiners, statisticians. That is key to our carrying out our mission. But the solutions to changes related to a firm's culture are unlikely to be found if we keep our focus exclusively, I know I've got economists here, so I'm going to say exclusively on economics and finance. We have so much to learn from psychology, from ethics, from management more broadly. And that's one of the reasons I'm excited about the work that we're doing in the New York Fed, engaging experts from disciplines across the spectrum, and also our panel discussion. Of course, we're bringing together experts from many fields. Their insights are going to help inform my thinking, or hopefully all of our thinking, and help us move forward on this important work. Thank you.
Hi, again, my name is Grace Lordan, and I'm an associate professor here at the LSE. And this week I'm teaching on the Executive Masters in Behavioural Science. And that isn't a pitch for more money for the LSE, to give you some confirmation about what John said. I was reflecting on it last night when I was preparing what to say, and about 80% of what I teach in that course is really relevant for finance and the professional services more broadly. For those of you who are new to behavioural science, I want you to try and see the world through my eyes for this hour and a half. So unlike economists who believe that when people make decisions, they weigh up costs, benefits, and risk in a very systematic manner, behavioural scientists believe in two types of thinking: a fast, impulsive thinking, that's our system one, and our second type of thinking, which is slow and very, very deliberate. System one has been shown to be affected by a myriad of biases by psychologists, and it often hits the headlines. They have very cute names, so it makes good press. A more nuanced reading of the literature will tell you that actually when people get to learn by doing, the biases that you're making with your very, very fast brain do actually go away and you become close to the rational decision-making process that economists hold so tightly. But there are two big exceptions. So the first is when you have negative emotions, and the second is when you are in a bad environment. And people who actually rely on their gut and use their system 1 for thinking are high-frequency traders without a doubt. They do incredibly well when they're in a steady state and they're in quite a good environment. But what happens when things start going wrong, like the global financial crisis? In that particular case, they're suffering negative emotions themselves, which actually feeds on their ability to perform in the firm at that one particular point in time. But of course, this is not somebody whose football team has just lost. This is replicated across the entire firm. So that creates a negative environment in which they're doing work in. So it's incredibly stressful, so it's no doubt that this actually affects outcomes of the firms. But what about system 2 thinking? So I do a lot of work with firms who are thinking about long-form investments or thinking about where to put some money into particular projects that won't have gains very, very far in the future. And they do a very deliberate thinking process, like the finance department teaches them to do, NPV calculations, costs, benefits, risk. When somebody is overly optimistic about a project, they inflate the benefits and they underestimate the cost. If you don't believe me, just look at all the public policy projects that came in with really high bills that ran both over time and over budget. So the core of business in financial and professional service, regardless of what firm you're working in, is how we put our money into projects, investments, or other things that actually will have very long-term payoffs. And the planning fallacy is alive and well in System 2 thinking. So when it comes to System 2 thinking, there's two things that you need to keep a watch out for as well, and that's the environment and also emotions. So I'm really proud to be here today kind of talking about culture, because obviously culture is the environment. So I know here at the LSE we're trying to really think about how behavioural insights can be used to inform culture within banking, and together with Karina Robinson, who's sitting here in the audience, we will launch the Inclusion Initiative later on this year. And it would be...
Can we just say we're going to be asking for money?
Karina's going to be asking for money, not me. But what I will say, which is different to what I think the rest of the panel is going to say, is that a good culture doesn't necessarily give you a good outcome. So I can stand here and talk to you about groupthink, and I can show you groupthink and toxic cultures all over the financial and professional services. But equally, I can show you groupthink where there are people who are sitting in meetings discussing issues that are important to their company on a day-to-day basis. And it should be no surprise to you that this arises in cultures that actually can be seen as good. High levels of job satisfaction, high levels of happiness. What makes us happier than when people are agreeing with us and we're over-focusing on the information that we share together? So for me as a behavioural scientist, the term good culture should be pushed to a state where not only do we have happy workers who are going to work and enjoying themselves, but also workers who are pushing themselves to have innovative and creative thinking. And these are meetings where people are getting challenged and you're pushing the frontier. In financial and professional services, one of the most important parameters is risk. How can you expect to have risk when people are over-focusing on shared information in meetings? I've done lots of experiments where we've flushed this out and essentially shown that if you give people packs with information, they will always over-focus on the information that is shared in those packs and fail to discuss the information that is hidden, if you like, to those particular groups. So when I think about culture in the professional service, I'm thinking more than about happiness of our workers. I'm thinking about pushing boundaries for innovative and creative workers. And even though today is about organizational culture, I do want to mention customers in banking. I think one of our frontiers here in behavioural science and in the financial professional services is to give more agency to customers. I mentioned System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 2 thinking, when people are taking on mortgages and they're taking on insurance policies, they do try to have a very deliberative process. But one of the most fascinating things actually to come from a colleague and a co-author of mine, Michael Keane, in Oxford, is that very often when they're making these complicated decisions, they don't really know what they're actually choosing between. And I can see financial professional services emerging now, thanks to some of the reforms that we've had, as almost like a doctor-patient relationship. So where it's the job of the financial advisor to put the customer in a state where they're very, very confident about what they're choosing. And behavioural science can help here, because even though this isn't a biased decision-making, we're quite good at thinking about how people should process information when they are informationally overloaded. And the last thing that I want to say is about System 1 thinking. The people in our populations who are biased in their decision-making on a day-to-day basis with how they spend their expenditure are people who are stressed and are people who are feeling financial stress. So these are individuals at the bottom end of the socioeconomic status distribution. And I do feel that there is a role for financial and professional services to put in place nudges sometimes shoves, and also commitment devices to help people and inform them on how they're making decisions on a day-to-day basis. But the key thing has to be that agency stays with the customer. Other industries don't do that, and I think that's where the financial and professional services should have integrity. So the upshot that I want to give you is that behavioural science does have a role to play in the financial and professional services. It is a weird and wonderful science, and I think the reason that we're weird and wonderful is because of our marriage to data and also being very outcome driven. So, all the work that we do is lined up to think about net present value of the projects that you roll out. And I talk to financial and professional service people all the time, and they say, we have very long horizons. I started as a health economist. Pharmaceutical companies have very long horizons, and they use these type of methodologies all the time. So I do hope that after today, I can convert you to becoming interested in behavioural science. Thank you.
If you want. Yes, you should. Okay, so my name is Edmund Schuster. I'm an associate professor in law, so that's an important disclaimer. I'm not a behavioral scientist, and as a corporate lawyer, you could even say I'm as far as you can be from being a behavioral scientist. Now, what I want to talk about briefly is how corporate law has been ignoring insights from behavioral science and areas where perhaps these insights can be valuable. John mentioned jokingly that economists and lawyers are basically the same people. I very much disagree on some level. At the same time, if you look at my area of law, at corporate law, we very much use the same starting points that economists use in designing rules, in analyzing rules, and in designing quasi-legal frameworks that companies use. That's a very simple framework that you're all familiar with, and within this framework, all sorts of behavioral biases, personal preferences, risk preferences held by senior managers within an organization are basically regarded as a problem that corporate law is there to solve. The idea is that the socially optimal level of risk-taking is best estimated by looking at what diversified shareholders want the organization to do. And so if you then look at what senior managers want, what senior managers try to do, to the extent that there's any tension between that and what shareholders want, this is a problem, and this problem needs to be fixed. And it is fixed within the framework of corporate law. That's the basic framework. Now, one interesting aspect here is that corporate law explicitly tries to counteract this notion that senior managers of all companies, including financial institutions, have too low an appetite for risk. And so corporate law explicitly tries to encourage more risk-taking to ensure that senior managers behave in a way that corresponds with the risk-taking preferences of shareholders. And so from that perspective, if we move to the financial industry, you could say that corporate law on the one hand and financial regulation to a large extent really end up pulling in opposite directions. With corporate law, because it's the standard corporate law that applies to all companies, trying to counteract those preferences by managers, and then financial regulation to a certain extent trying to pull them back into a more risk-averse state. So some research I've done with colleagues here at the LSE from both finance and law shows, for instance, that arrangements that are generally considered, at least within the standard framework, as constituting bad governance, arrangements that limit the extent to which shareholders can influence and can hold accountable managers in banks, has resulted in lower failure rates, lower risk-taking levels during the financial crisis, and a lower probability of needing government support. So in this area, I think it would be useful to analyze very closely what are the preferences of the different players involved, and do we shape our legal rules in a way that actually leverages the risk preferences and the general behavioral biases of the parties that are most closely aligned with what we consider to be the public interest. The second area where I think it would be interesting to use the insights from behavioral science for corporate law has to do with default rules. So again, if you look at a standard model of how law works, we look at default rules as practically irrelevant, except for that, for the fact that if we have a default rule that companies can then disapply, we should be careful about the rational apathy of shareholders and basically the exploitation of shareholders by their managers. So we try to create a framework where we have a very pro-shareholder default and that then allow companies to deviate from that. We do that, at least in the UK, we do that both in our general legal rules, but also if you look at the corporate governance code, for instance. This whole idea of having comply or explain is based on the idea that let's start with a very pro-shareholder viewpoint, and then, of course, managers can always convince their shareholders to deviate and go into a different direction. Now, if we look at the evidence, there's an exceptionally high compliance with those default rules. And if you look at the views of investors, but also the views of corporate lawyers working in this space, the bar is extremely high if you want to deviate from a government default. This just smells bad. People don't like it, and you need to have an exceptionally good reason in order to do that. And so the assumption that just give them the options and they will then engineer a good solution, that's just not realistic. In a way, it is unrealistic, I would argue, to have this vision of creating a neutral corporate law. In effect, the assumption that defaults don't matter in corporate law is as wrong as the assumption that defaults in other areas don't mention. There's a very strong kind of nudge force of those default standards. And this plays a role in several areas. And if we want companies, financial institutions, to take into account the interests of customers, the interests of employees, we probably need to do much more in the design of our organizational rules than just give them the option of, appointing a director who looks after their interests or having some board, because companies to a very large extent go with whatever the default is and take the path of least resistance. So I think the idea of nudging companies in the right direction has real applications in corporate law. I should also mention that recent developments in the corporate governance field, at least, with a stronger emphasis on corporate purpose and how corporate purpose is defined and is then communicated in a way that at least there's a chance of it kind of permeating the whole organization, from my perspective, certainly a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Celia.
Okay, so we've been given 3 to 5 minutes, so I'm going to talk really fast. And I will be brief. I am a behavioral scientist, and I'm a business school professor by day and a collaborator of the Banking Standards Board by night and some days. And a lot of my career has actually been focused on how to create a more ethical culture, particularly in the financial services industry, because I started out as a rookie prof the year of the financial crisis. And as this was happening, I got a lot of calls because I was the core ethics professor at London Business School, asking about how to create more ethical cultures, and I didn't have a good answer. And so I spent most of the last decade trying to come up with a better answer to that question that I didn't have then. So I'm going to tell you 3 things and then give you 1 example of what I've learned in the last decade. And the first thing is the most important, and it's going to sound so basic as to be almost tautological, except that we seem to forget it all the time, which is that culture change is people change, because culture is human. Culture is only experienced by individuals, right? There's no organizational culture on Mars, but you stick Matt Damon there by himself, there's an organizational culture on Mars. And it matters how people interpret and perceive and understand and neglect and circumvent things that exist in their environment. So the first thing is that culture change involves people, and we have to involve people in culture change. I think a lot of organizations focus on things that they can control, which isn't really people. So they work on implementing new policies or new procedures or new, lots of communications. But it doesn't actually involve the people who will be the experiencers and celebrants and disseminators of culture. The second thing is that culture change is slow. And no one wants to hear this. And I've said this to lots of organizations, and then they hire someone else to help them because they want the person who's like, no, in 3 months we can make change. And the third thing is that it can be done, okay? So those are 3 things that I've learned. And the example I'm going to give you is from work that I've done in the last 2 years, because it's slow, with the Banking Standards Board and their Behavioural Insights Unit, working with committed financial institutions in the UK to make culture change and to learn about how to do it more effectively. And I'm really glad that John mentioned the Ash conformity experiments, because the way that we designed this experiment that we ran in a bank, and I know experiment is a dirty word and it shouldn't be, it can be, but it isn't in this context, is that in the Ash conformity experiments, actually 75% of the people in the original experiment said at least one wrong answer when other people were saying wrong answers. But the way to make that conformity effect go away is to have one person in the room say the right answer first, right? So no one likes being the sole person with their head above the parapet, but as soon as they're with one other person, everyone's more willing to go. So if we focus on culture change at the individual level, and getting that one first person to be there as a peer to help, that's how we made change in this organization, and this is how we showed it. So this organization, it has many regions. So we worked with them and took 2 regions of 1,000 people. And in one region, we implemented an intervention, which was a very simple intervention, which was having peers, volunteer peers, be willing to function as, now we call them guardians, but you can call them whatever you want, just someone who you can go to help navigate how you want to speak up. This could be many ways. It could be come to a meeting with me, or help me figure out HR systems, or just be my friend or be my sounding board. We gave them really not very much training. So we gave them some training on active listening. We gave them some training about the ways in which they could navigate the system of the organization. But mostly we let them own this role. And the financial institution was willing to give them a couple hours a week legitimately away from their job to enact this role. That's it. Then we waited 9 months, right? We waited 9 months because you can't measure change overnight. One of the most interesting things about this process was trying to hold back the organization that thought it was going well from rolling it out across the whole organization before we could collect outcome data, but we managed to do it. They're fantastic. And 9 months later, we collected outcome data. We collected baseline data at the beginning when both regions were the same, outcome data 9 months later. And we found that conditional on the respondent being aware that this role existed, the people who were in the experimental region, we were more optimistic about speaking up in their organization, felt that they had higher levels of efficacy, they felt more efficacious, more able to speak up, and felt safer to speak up in that region. So we were able to show in a data-driven, empirically robust way that a very small intervention can create real change. Now, doing that required a couple things that I would like organizations to gain more comfort with. One of them is to do experiments. Now, that word causes people to freak out, and I don't really know why, but when we call them pilots, we sometimes have better take-up, because organizations are used to pilots but not so used to experiments. But it allows us to understand if things are actually working and what parts of them are working and why. And the second really key thing is to have organizations not be afraid to collect data, right? Organizations collect data all the time, but usually they want to hear like that 98% of people are super happy with stuff. You need to collect data about what's actually going on and not be afraid to hear the sort of stuff that you need to improve along the way. So if we design our outcome data measures to only hear the good stuff, we will make positive change even less quickly than it's possible to do when we're doing our best. All right, so that's my 3 minutes.
Hi, I'm Martin Oehmke from the finance department here. Like Celia, I started as an assistant professor right around the financial crisis, and I, in a way, went the, say, more traditional economist way, thinking about incentives and institutional frictions to understand fragilities in the financial system, systemic risk, bank regulation, issues like that. So I'm not an expert on behavioral science. At the same time, now 10 years on from the financial crisis, I think aspects of of behavioral science can probably add to how we deal with the legacy of the financial crisis and implement better financial regulation. Now, of course, economists haven't completely shut this out, right? So there's rumor that you sometimes read on blogs or in the media that all economists still, believe in the rational, decision-making of what's it called, Homo economicus. It's not quite true, but I do think that, in regulation, there hasn't been as much of a push into incorporating both behavioral biases and incorporating behavioral science. And I think the question is, what's the reason for that? And, I would, as an economist, argue that when it comes to individual behavioral biases, one of the issues we have as economists is that it becomes much harder to think about what a regulator should maximize, in the sense that you have to make some difficult, potentially paternalistic decisions that I think a lot of economists shy away from. And so I think that's one reason that incentives have been a bigger focus of regulation, even though I think some of the empirical evidence shows us that biases definitely were an important contributor to the crisis and its aftermath. I also think that organizational culture is an important aspect that economists could incorporate more. Of course, there is organizational economics and, theories of groupthink and so on, even, within economics. But, if I look at, one of the, I think, examples relevant to this panel that I teach in an executive course here at LSE, a fixed income course, is, a day on benchmark interest rates, LIBOR, Euribor, and so on. And of course, as John mentioned, that's been, one of the key areas where we are dealing with kind of potentially bad or unethical behavior in the financial sector. And I think, John could, I think, attest to, there's been a lot of work done into, well, how could we design alternative interest rates? How could we change the incentives? But I think to ultimately understand what went on when, individual submitters at banks were submitting their LIBOR numbers every morning, I think they're understanding the organizational culture, understanding or using inputs from behavioral science to see, what are the conflict of interest that this particular individual is in, how is within the context of this organization the individual making a decision is an, I think, important aspect if you want to get to the root of what went on here. Now, as an economist, then my follow-up question to the behavioral scientists, on the panel or in the audience would be, how do we make this tangible, right? So I'm very much open to bringing into how we do financial regulation these aspects from behavioral science, but I think most economists would ask, okay, in some tangible sense, how do we do this? How do we measure good culture, and how do we, or can we even prescribe or implement good culture in financial institutions or other firms? Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Tom Reeder. So I'm a psychologist, and I'm interested in the role of culture in industrial accidents, so plane crashes, oil rigs exploding, medical accidents, and the like. And in these industries, culture is seen as a leading indicator of safety. It's actually used as a way to detect what problems are unfurling. And I'm interested in finance because financial disasters or scandals, so whether that's LIBOR or rogue trading or mortgage mis-selling, they often show and have very similar cultural problems in the organizations as those in airlines that have an accident, or hospitals. For example, pressure for productivity over safety, perceived pressure to take amongst employees extreme risks, normalization of rule breaking, barriers to people raising concerns. Now, these are probably issues that most people would recognize, but when you think about culture measurement, which is something I'm doing a lot of work on at present, they actually raise a few problems. This is to say, in an institution where risk-taking has become normalized and rule-breaking is regular, how likely is it that you'll be able to pick up on this, for example, through a self-report method? Mm-hmm. And what about institutions where bad practice is endemic? These kinds of institutions are quite unlikely to even undertake a culture survey or participate in research. So surveys are very valuable, but what we've been interested at the LSE is using behavioral science to develop new ways of culture measurement. And I'll just give you two quick examples. So the first example relates to work that we've been doing in healthcare, looking at the safety culture of hospitals. Traditionally, you'd measure safety culture through staff surveys, possibly other safety data. To achieve this, we've been looking at patient accounts and family accounts of unsafe care. So complaints written by patients and their families to hospitals about bad experiences in hospital. So there's about 140,000 complaints submitted to the NHS every year. We've collected 3,000 or 4,000 of them from around 50 or 60 trusts in the UK. And what you find there is that the pattern of behaviours and attitudes reported by patients about their care. So, for example, misdiagnoses, medication errors, people not listening to concerns about safety, problems in hygiene, bad attitudes, and there's lots of other issues, low-level issues, car parking, all these kinds of things. What you find is the profile of complaints at a hospital, so patients reporting on the culture as problematic, is correlated with hospital mortality data. And in fact, it explains hospital mortality data more powerfully than institutional data around incident reporting and some of the safety culture surveys that are undertaken. And the reason is that patients and their families have an external view on the culture of hospitals. They're independent from it. They're at the sharp end of things going wrong. And they don't experience some of the interpersonal challenges of reporting on problems. And you can imagine this transposed to the financial sector. Financial firms receive complaints from customers, investors, lots of different people. You could imagine taking these kinds of insights from healthcare and applying them into finance. The other area of work we've been looking at is natural language processing and looking at analysing earning call data, so CEOs and the teams responding to questions from investors, Glassdoor data where employees report their experiences inside of an organisation, annual reports, and looking at how culture is diffused in the language of an organisation. So analysing millions of words here to try and come up with a profile of an organization. For example, in an earnings call, to what extent do the CEO and the team respond concretely to questions about what's going on in their organization? Or do they bluster? Do they talk about the future a lot and not talk about the present very much? On Glassdoor, to what extent do employees talk about work pressure? They may not talk about ethics. Ethics and issues of compliance may manifest in different ways. People talking about pressure to do things, incentives, bonuses, whatever this looks like. And so we've been looking at this in large companies in the European Stock Market Index, primarily from the perspective of predicting adaptive and strong cultures, but it's also very relevant for identifying cultures with problems inside of them. And some of our work inside of the financial sector, we find a lot of inside the financial sector, you can start to look at for example, the connection between what the CEO and top team say, how they talk in an earnings call and in the annual report, to how employees talk. You can look at how the values being expressed by one overlaps with the values being talked about on the ground and use it as a bit of a measurement of cultural coherence. So in conclusion, I think behavioral science has a lot to offer the study of culture, in particular in advancing measurement of culture. You can only really change a culture through measuring it. And surveys are very useful and powerful, but sometimes you need more dynamic measures. And you also, how do you measure those organizations that don't want to be surveyed? there's ethics around doing that. We can talk about that. But behavioral science is increasingly giving opportunities to regulators, investors, many parties to do this. Thank you.
So can I thank all of our panelists? I mean, I thought those were fascinating thumbnail sketches, if we can call it that. And I'm sure you have a lot more to say to us. I pulled out a number of threads that I thought actually ran through, even though you're in different fields and have different disciplines. What we're going to do, John and I will ask a few questions and get a bit of conversation going with the panel. And at some point, if I remember to look at my watch, we'll break in and ask all of you if you have some questions, because we do want to hear from all of you as well. So we'll start just now. In fact, why don't I just kick off, if that's okay? Several of you talked about, about a good environment as opposed to a bad environment, and the difference that has on people's decisions and how they behave. I was very interested in rule breaking becomes the norm. I mean, you see some of these patterns. So I will just have to say that I don't think most of us have ever grown up. And I think if a new rule comes along that pertains to our world, I mean, I do this, my brain thinks, I would get round it like that, but then I choose not to get round it. I mean, I think that's a natural human thing. And so you can see how that becomes dangerous if that suddenly becomes acceptable. But there's something about how people feel, what the nature of the experience is in the workplace. Out of our survey at the BSB, we have a number of factors that we look at. Some of them over the last 4 years have shown some improvement. And actually, a lot of our bankers, the people who are taking the survey, are seeing their leaders in a better light. And that's actually a good thing. Not hugely improved, but somewhat improved. One area that we've seen almost no change is in the area of well-being. And that's a real concern. Lots of ways that the questions are asked, and the results that come back are well-being is still a major issue. And so I guess there's so little improvement there, and I'm just wondering, are there other ways that we could work with firms and help firms to begin to tackle that area? What can behavioral science do to do something that all of our wonderful HR policies today are not actually achieving? Is anybody? Yeah, Grace.
Yeah, so I'm lucky that I spent a lot of time with happiness economists, so I feel that I have a slight edge in addressing this question. I mean, the one thing that we know about people when they're going about their work is that they do want to feel challenged, and they do want to feel that they get to work with autonomy. So it's not surprising to me that within firms where a lot of the culture from HR is geared up to talk about how would you feel if you were going to whistleblow? How would you feel if you were going to say something beyond your management spectrum? That isn't having any effect on the well-being that a person feels as they go about their day-to-day job. And I think one of the biggest lessons from behavioural science is that one of the things that motivates employees the most is appeal to their ego. So even though we all might feel that we're extraordinarily altruistic, we do want to feel valued from an egotistical perspective. And to do that, connecting the meaning of the type of work that a firm is trying to do to the skills that the employee is doing on a day-to-day basis, and really letting them understand the value that they're bringing to the team day on day becomes really important. And I think this comes back to what I said in the beginning. You can get employees that might actually say that they do have high levels of job satisfaction. But when you get the highest level of job satisfaction is when you have people in teams and they're being pushed to be innovative, they're being pushed to be creative, and they know that they're actually being valued. And I would dare to say moving some of these well-being policies out of the HR function and into the main business could give a lot of rewards beyond what we're seeing already.
That's very helpful. Anyone else have a comment?
So, not specifically on the well-being point, but I think if you look at corporate purpose and the extent to which a feeling of a purpose or a mission can influence culture, again, I think it's difficult, at least in the UK environment, to take these attempts to create corporate purpose and make it more relevant very seriously for the employees. Because on the one hand, they get the message that there's some higher mission, and then all the legal rules say, do what your investors want to do every day. And so I think to the extent that you can create or influence culture by stating what the company is supposed to do, what you think the mission is, we also need some legal change there.
The one thing that I wanted to contribute is there was a great article recently by Herminia Ibarra about what corporate practices can we throw away. I think we're much better at adding than subtracting. And I think most of us have the feeling in our work that things are overwhelming, right? We can be reached 24/7, there's more and more things to do. I keep getting notifications that I haven't completed my health and safety training yet, my online health and safety. I did start it, and then I gave up. And I think that organizations would improve people's well-being by thinking strategically about what practices they can give up. Is there any annual reporting? Is there any performance management? Is there any meetings? Can you institute 15-minute meetings or half-an-hour meetings just to make our days seem less overwhelming?
That's helpful. Everybody doesn't have to respond, but if you have something to say. No, John, you want to?
Well, first of all, I love the thing about what can you stop doing. Back in San Francisco, one of my colleagues came up with the idea of stop doing it around policies and around activities, and this was in bank supervision. So it's almost unheard of that in bank supervision you would say stop doing it, except the bank supervision, of course, telling the banks to stop doing it. That's a different thing. But getting people to have that comfort to say, we should be reassessing, reexamining how we do things and what do we really need to do. I think that's important. I guess the question I have is we've been doing this work for now in New York and obviously the BSB and others for years, focused on, I think, a lot of issues around incentives, around legal and regulatory structures and things. The purpose of the meeting, the panel today and the discussion today and the ongoing work that we're doing together is to bring in views from other disciplines besides law, I'm going to say besides law and economics. So if you were to say for the besides law and economics crowd, the three of you, what's the key thing that you think that the regulatory community should be including in their thinking about issues around banking culture, misconduct, ethical, unethical behavior? What's the thing that we should be adding to our toolbox as we think about the regulatory framework and how to supervise the biggest institutions?
Tom, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the kinds of behaviors people have been talking about, whether it's speaking up behaviors or challenging or reporting a problem, these are behaviors that are easily disincentivized and not that easily incentivized. And I think that's part of the problem with focusing on incentives, is that some of the behaviors that underpin a good culture, the incentives are far more social than they're monetary or even in terms of career reward. And so there may be some case to kind of tease these apart in the thinking of banking culture. The other thing is, and you see this in many industries, it's just the lack of alignment between what an institution says is important and what actually happens. We know as psychologists again and again, people prioritize what actually happens, not what people say is going to happen. And there's lots of studies showing this. And I suspect a lot of the work on culture, as Celia pointed out, is a lot of communicative work, communicating what happens and communicating the values that are important. I wonder still, if you're thinking about people at the operational side of an institution, whether they really believe that. And whether, observing one negative event, someone reporting a problem and then them, not getting called up on it or not being promoted or whatever, that's going to weigh in their mind quite heavily compared to all of the bump that you get from the institution. And I'm not sure, this isn't just finance, but I think this is the issue with a lot of culture to work. It's a lot of talk and expression of values, but demonstrating those values is tricky. It's that attitude-behavior gap, and I think that's probably one of the key things.
I don't know if this is hugely unpopular, what I'm about to say, but I am a fan of principle-based regulation. It is one of the papers that I'm working on right now is about how it's a computer simulation that demonstrates that if you have a highly structured regulation system, the more loopholes you close, the exponentially you increase uptake of other loopholes that haven't been closed. And I know that there's fear of moving towards more principle-based means of regulation because then it's not clear and then the lawyers get involved. But ultimately, principles can encompass a wider variety of behaviors than specifics.
So sticking with the theme of behavioral science, I think framing is really important. And I think we have to remember in financial and professional services today, there's a cohort of individuals coming through that had nothing to do with the regulations that are now kind of layered on them. And they get whistleblowing training and they get conduct training, and it's this compliance that always has this negative frame. So I would like to see us moving towards measuring more positive aspects like inclusion. So thinking about seriously how we measure inclusion and whether or not it's an accurate pulse point with respect to behavioural risk, and doing positive interventions for people within firms that move away from thinking about whistleblowing, but thinking about how do you actually get voice within particular meetings, not just from the perspective of holding up the ethics of the organisation, but also from the perspective of moving the organisation forward with respect to creativity and innovation. And I think, which is really great, that some of the big data houses are starting to measure this. So I know IHS Markets is doing this, and I know Refinitiv is doing this. And I think that's a really positive step in the right direction, actually, that we will be able to see these indexes moving across firms across time.
I wanted to quickly follow up on one of the things Celia just said. So, coming from the other side, thinking about, what would I as an economist be hoping for to get from behavioral science? I think, this example of the closing of loopholes and, the more you close, people try to get around them, the issue of regulatory arbitrage. I think, if you're coming from the incentive side, at some point, let's think about bank regulation, that you realize at some point that, becomes a huge issue. And the more you regulate, say, the official banking sector, the more you worry about the same activities being done essentially, say, in shadow banking or, alternative types of structures. And so robustness of regulation, I think, is something where culture and behavioral sciences would potentially have something big to add, both in terms of preventing regulatory arbitrage, whatever way you write it down, right, there's going to be some way around it that legally is okay, but if the culture, okay, in quotation marks, but if the culture were the right one, then maybe this would happen less. So that's, I think, one kind of hope I would have, how regulation can be improved through behavioral science. And the other one is one of kind of, I mentioned early on, last year, it seemed to me, if you work on financial regulation, it was one event after another 10 years, after Lehman. And, as that event fades slowly kind of out of our collective memory, I think behavioral science and organizational culture could be a way that through some sort of institutional knowledge, the memory, if you wish, of Lehman and the lessons learned, hopefully will, continue to be passed on in organizations, as opposed to now that you have, the first people who've worked in an organization for 10 years without such an event and basically not knowing about it. So I think that's kind of a second aspect where I could see a big contribution from kind of the organizational knowledge in carrying on the memory of Lehman and everything that ensued.
Thank you. John, you wanted to?
Yeah, I want to pick up. You by mentioning the now over 11 years since Lehman. I was talking to one of my colleagues who joined an organization recently. We were talking about the challenge of joining an organization from outside. And one of the things they said, which is a little bit kind of runs counter to what you're saying, the memory of the crisis and everything, I get all that, is that these memories then become entrenched views on how to do things. So you have this insider-outsider problem, where the people who were here 11 years ago or 20 years, depending on which crisis you're talking about, there have been a lot of different crises around the world, and that those end up being, in a way, such a powerful gravitational force for how you view about how the organization should or should not move ahead and how you do all the things that you were talking about. So I think it's a fascinating part of culture about you don't want to lose track of these important lessons and all the things you learned. At the same time, it can kind of stop the organization from moving forward. I don't know how you react to that kind of response.
Well, during our earlier discussion, previous to the panel on, the more kind of a monetary policy-based discussion over lunch, one of the things I was wondering about, and it goes a little bit in the same direction as you were saying, is that, so for example, if at the Fed you think about, economists thinking right there about, asset purchases, QE, things like that, would you have a sense that in a way, that way of thinking has become ingrained over the last 10 years and that might become an issue going forward?
Right, so I think that's exactly, we'll broaden it out, but I think that this issue of how you want to maintain and energize kind of the collective memory, but at the same time be open to inclusive to newer view and outside views is one of those management challenges, especially when you have things that are so incredibly scarring and powerful in people's psychology. If you as an economist, I will tell you, if you ever want to experience how emotion and personal experience affects your views in the world, go through a crisis. I mean, that's the one that's going to, kind of cement people's understanding of the world.
Can I move from organizational and institutional memory and perhaps look forward a little bit, because I'm very interested in the place of behavioral science going forward. Now, I know everyone may groan if I mention the word technology, but technology clearly is changing how all of us live our lives and do what we do at work, inside and outside. And may well be changing the way we think, our attention spans, the connections we make, and so forth. It may not be immediately clear. So behavior will change. We've heard culture is a dynamic thing. I call it organic. It's never still. But is there something in behavioral science that can help us kind of see some of the behavioral changes that are coming from something like the technology that is insinuating itself in all of our lives? So I'm interested in outcomes here. I think that's something the BSB is really interested in. Grace, here.
I think one of the big tenets from behavioral science is that the people incrementally cheat. So we spoke about this before we had the session today. So I think one of the great things with technology is the ability to harvest data. And within that data, there's probably pulse points that you can gather very, very quickly from younger cohorts that are coming through, and then give them sanctions much earlier than we were able to do before. And I think here in the UK, I spoke to Andrew Bailey about this, and he basically said that's really the whole tenet of them looking at non-financial crime. So really thinking about that there's other things that are embedded in data besides the usual routine indicators that allow us to predict these right tail outcomes very, very much ahead of time than we used to be in the past. So really focusing on the outcome, but focusing on prediction. So using machine learning and using data science in combination with behavioral science.
So on this point, I think that there are good reasons to be more skeptical about where we are with the technology when it comes to predicting, especially when it comes to predicting behavior that is unwanted and is known to be unwanted. It is, I think, often conflated what systems can do in highly complex but still structured and repetitive areas like image recognition. And I think humans are so much more complex, and kind of adversarial situation where people know that behavior is unwanted is so much harder to predict. That I think it is often overestimated how close we are to having systems in place that can actually replace or even meaningfully augment what we can do with traditional means.
Any other views?
Well, I'm just thinking about what's done in other sectors and other industries where huge advances have been made through technology on picking up on problems. You look at something, I do a lot of work in the air traffic sector, and a major incident in an air traffic context is something called a loss of separation, which is just where two planes breach the minimum threshold of distance between them, which can be a couple of kilometers. It's actually nowhere near an incident, but the level of detection has got to the point that you can see problems occurring occurring before they are there. And I just wonder what that would look like in the finance context. That kind of that what's considered an incident, it's not after the event, it's actually in the run up to it. So I think there is a lot of, I think probably because the bar is quite low in financial services for doing this kind of work, there probably is a lot of scope for improvement with technology.
Take that on board, Sean.
So one question I have for the panel is that often, and it picks up on some themes that have been mentioned, is that we often try to address these instances, whether unethical behavior or misconduct or scandals or whatever the issue is, in a very siloed approach. I almost think of it as a top-down approach. We've got the, FX fixing or LIBOR or whatever it is. We need to address that. We have a lack of diversity and inclusion in financial services. We need to address that. We have these various issues. I guess my view on culture is that you have a culture in your organization, and this culture reaches into all aspects of the organization, including your view, how you approach diversity and inclusion, including the decision-making judgment, including all these things. Is there something that we should be approaching this differently and more of a attacking from the bottom up on the culture of the organization, as opposed to just demanding more and more programs to say, speak up, hotline, another video training thing, which we have 10 of them, by the way, to the New York Fed. And I too have an email telling me I need to complete one. So that's what I'll be doing today. But really, I'm just asking a more fundamental question. Right? We seem to have all these things. We all have these dozen training programs and all these things, and we seem to be attacking them as if they are idiosyncratic, specific issues, rather than just really about the underlying culture. Or is that just am I just missing the point here?
I have two things that I would say about that. One is I think culture change involves courage that a lot of organizations don't have. It means that they need to hear what's wrong and what it doesn't work for people, and a lot of organizations aren't ready to hear that. So now that I've spent some time doing work on encouraging speak up culture, I feel like I need to also do some work on some listening culture, because a lot of organizations are like, I've been saying the things and no one wants to hear, so did someone actually speak up in the forest if no one actually heard what they said? So I think that from bottom up, right, an organization needs to be open to messages if they're good and if they're bad. The other thing that I think is the big obstacle is the human desire to have their cake and eat it too, right? So they want to have a diverse and inclusive culture, but when that means that some people are going to be made uncomfortable, they're like, no, but I want to be completely comfortable and do this other thing. And you don't get to do both of these things. So some of it involves choices and the courage to recognize that to make these changes, you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Thank you very much for that. Let me break from the conversation we're having and see if we have some questions, and a lot of hands are going up. We'll turn here first. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists.
Could you just identify yourselves?
Yes, so my name is Daniel Beunza, and I am Associate Professor of Management at CAS Business School. Oh, thank you. I suppose you can hear me better now. I don't have to shout. So my name is Daniel Beunza, and I have a question for the panel. In the view of the panelists, has culture fundamentally changed over the past 10 years? And if not, do the panelists have radical proposals for what could possibly be done that has not been tried and that perhaps, who knows, might work?
Does anyone want to comment? Yeah.
So, I really would like to reframe culture change as something that brings value to business, and that things that we roll out that are going to change culture change gets costed in exactly the same way as you would any other project, because they tend to be quite expensive. And I think if you start doing that and you start canning the stuff that doesn't work and moving quickly to other things that do work in a trial and error approach, like we would approach something else in any business that's focused on profit maximizing, I think you will end up getting much more buy-in within the organization. I think at the moment it tends to sit outside the income generating part of the business. It's not linked to outcomes that are meaningful for businesses a lot of the time. So it ends up being a nice to have in a world where we're all under a lot of time pressure and working incredibly hard. So reframing, intervention style approach, linking to outcomes and calculating net present value.
Would you put it in incentives?
Yes. Absolutely.
I think that's the more right.
Because if you're linking it to business outcomes, then quite easily you can put it into your incentive structure.
Karina, and then we'll go here. Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to ask for money, but if any of you would like to donate something.
If any of you would like to donate something to the Inclusion Initiative, which Grace and I are starting, and one of the reasons behind it is because we do believe a more inclusive culture, which also involves, I think somebody was talking about active listening, because people can be speaking up, but if you're not listening, that is something we'd be happy to talk to you about later. But this is where I'd like somebody from the panel to come up with, because you were saying that one bad example, it doesn't matter how much you communicate, one bad example is the biggest thing. Now, many years ago, I was a journalist, and in 2008, I asked Peter Sands, who was then the CEO of Standard Chartered, why they'd actually come out of it quite well. Now, that was 2008, by the way, not perhaps 2010, where other things came up. And he said, we have always had a culture where we like people to come up and flag the bad news as soon as possible. Now, is there a way of doing that and rewarding that publicly?
Isn't that what airlines do now?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely you can. I don't know if you can incentivize it. Some companies have tried that, and you end up with people bringing up, you then have a glut of issues, bad issues that aren't important, but you can certainly publicize and reward good speaking up behaviors, I think. I mean, I think there is something around, as Celia said, we do spend a lot of time training people how to speak up. I don't know how many managers really go on training courses on how to listen. And so we've done some experiments at LSE looking at when people are trying to raise concerns and who doesn't listen and who does. And sometimes people can be trying to raise concerns, and they may not be doing it in they're pressing the red button and there's an alarm. They may be raising concerns in much more subtle ways, particularly if they're in a position without any power. And some of the work we've been doing has also been looking at things like airline, the dialogue in cockpits before a plane crashes. Okay, and you'll be surprised how many times a co-pilot is aware of a problem and is trying to communicate it to the pilot, but they don't just say, I think this piece of equipment's not working. They'll talk about it in kind of roundabout ways. For example, my altimeter is a bit different to your one. What do you think about that? And the pilot will say, well, my altimeter's pretty good. I quite like my altimeter. I've been relying on it for years. Actually, what they want to say is, we don't know what the altitude of the plane is. And I think this is some of the things that can be done for putting the onus on culture change, bouncing back onto managers, and not just putting it onto the employees and giving them something else to do.
Can I just ask a small favor? I'm flying back to North Carolina. Can you cool it with
as long as you're not on a Boeing Max, you'll be fine.
I actually think this is my job and leaders' jobs to not only create the space, to actually make that space actively. I think you have to be proactive. I think I'm kind of related to what you're saying. So as a leader in a small meeting or big, whatever it is it's actually not just about listening. It's actually about setting expectations that you look for people to speak that way. And when they're struggling with how to communicate, because often it's hard because you have senior management around and you're the person saying, I'm not sure how to get this framed right, is to help them do that and give them not only the space, but the encouragement. So that's how I experience it. I don't think it's just speaking up. I don't think it's just listening. It's actually setting expectations and then helping people to learn how to do that. I will say on that other industry that I said don't mention, one of the things I know from my wife being a specialist in this field is it's this thing about communication between people. It's also about who has authority. I mean, there's this long history of strong hierarchy hierarchy in institutions, whether it's aircraft or health, and that hierarchical structure really can interfere with effective decision making, especially in times of stress.
Yeah, I mean that's right. I mean it can be incredibly important for giving clarity, but it can stop important bits of information being communicated. Just one follow-up thought is sometimes people don't know exactly how to express their concerns. We imagine everyone in their mind knows exactly what's going on, but sometimes a concern can be quite grey. You're just aware that there's a problem, and it could be you're worried to look stupid by expressing it. And I think giving language as well on how to express a concern when you're not really sure what it is something we could do better.
So I will just say that when I was running a bank and I did performance reviews for my executive team at the end, and they knew they had to do this, I would say, that's fine, we've talked about you. Any feedback for me, and what can you tell me I'm not doing well enough or I've done badly? I just want to hear it, because no one would ever tell a chief executive, anything like that. And so doing that actually opens the floodgates a little bit. People learn it's okay to give you some bad news. Sorry, Celia, did you want to say something?
I've been thinking about Daniel's question, and there's just one thing that I wanted to say quickly, which is I think a lot of organizations talking about radical culture change. On average, in aggregate, it's hard to change the culture of 1 million people, right? If you're moving that needle, it's a big, fat needle. But within any organization, say an organization has 10,000 people, year on year, when you do the same sort of engagement survey, you're probably not going to see a lot of change. And then people make a big deal about something going from 86% to 88%. And it's probably not even statistically significant. But within that 10,000 people, there's 10 groups of 1,000 and whatever, many groups of 100. And the groups of 100, there's probably several of them that got a lot better and several of them that got a lot worse. So because we often have the data, culture change, I think, happens in a more microcosmic way. And all of us experience our culture in a much more microcosmic way than, LSE. What matters is the Department of Behavioral Sciences, not what matters is the BSB, not all of their member firms. So to take a more granular look, I think you'd get a lot more insight by looking at what's gotten worse or better within smaller categories.
So that's interesting, because the BSB assessment with a firm will give all incredibly sophisticated feedback about the findings for the whole firm, but then it will go into major divisions within the firm, and that gives often, just what you're saying, a different viewpoint, and going down deeper is probably very helpful. So there's a question here, a question there, and then a question there. So this gentleman, and then...
Thank you. Nicholas Beale. It was said at the beginning that culture is about people, and clearly that's very, very true. But arguably, culture is also about the decisions that organizations make. And as Susan was saying, this is increasingly involving technology. And I think over the next 10 years, especially in financial services, we're seeing more and more of these decisions being made with technological systems. And that seems to me to be both a problem and an opportunity. It's a problem because you can have wonderful human culture, but if the AI culture's rotten, you could in fact end up making a whole load of terrible decisions and the humans might be barely aware of. The opportunity is that it's in principle much easier to instrument AI than to instrument humans. And maybe we need to start thinking about these organizations as symbionts between humans and AI, and look at how you change the culture of decision-making in that symbiotic organization, and not just in terms of the people, important and vital though those are.
Thank you. I don't know if there's a comment. I mean, that's a very interesting comment. If no response. Behind you with the microphone? Yeah.
My name is Eva Michaela, and I'm a member of the law department here. And I'd like to say, because Edmund hinted on this, but there's been a lot of recent development in the law incorporating corporate culture. So for example, the failure to prevent model that we apply for bribery, where we used to have a world where organizations had to be liable in bribery, you had to show that the CEO suite had done something wrong. And now the burden has been reversed, and the law requires so the liability arises when there's a failure to prevent. Same is in the context of modern slavery, and there's also rules in the Finance Act. I would also say that very clearly a singular focus on shareholder value can create bad culture. But I would almost go as far as saying that is probably a 1980s perspective of law and economics. We've moved a very long way away from this by having rules on remuneration for executives. The 2018 Corporate Governance Code, and Edmund mentioned this, if you compare that with previous versions, that is no longer singularly focused on shareholders. So I would be a bit more optimistic about what has happened in terms of legal change in context of corporate culture. And then I've got a tiny question, which is about the focus of corporate strategy. What I read is that CEOs have a maximum 5-year horizon, and any project that's below that, nobody touches. Does that affect this space?
So while you're thinking of an answer, I would say that corporate culture, to my mind, isn't a project, and it's not something to be done and then do a post-implementation review 3 years later. That's not what it is. That there needs to be a mechanism that is ongoing and that is across an organization and that keeps going. So if a CEO moves on, someone else picks up the reins, and one of the first things they should find out about is what is the corporate culture and what do they value. They may see it differently. There isn't one corporate culture that's the right one either. But to my mind, thinking of it as a project and thinking of just changing it, sometimes you want to keep what you have. I see it a little differently. So I've filled in the time while you're thinking about any answers.
I mean, I think a lot of the problem is how we think about culture projects, right? So there are a lot of industries like pharma and tech where the horizons are very, very long, but they invest in these projects with very, very long-term horizons, not fully sure about what the outcome is actually going to be. And I think if firms can quite clearly link better culture, better inclusion to their organization's vital outcomes, so what they're getting with respect to their profit and loss, what they're getting with respect to innovation, you will change minds even with a short window of 5 years. But there are these other industries, pharmaceutical and tech, they're struggling with the same problems that we are struggling with now. Even these founder companies where you have owners at the helm, they're not investing in culture because very often we have people who are going in, who are advising people on culture change, and they're not linking those projects, which end up being incredibly expensive, to something that fundamentally matters to the firm. So when time becomes pressurized, they're the first things to let go. If we embed it in the business case, I think we have a chance of it surviving.
I would just, reply to Eva's remarks. That I agree that there's much more that we say about other groups that we want to take into account and how important values are and so on. But the core rules haven't really changed. And so I think the question is, how credible is it to talk about purpose, to talk about social responsibility and environment, if at the same time you say, every year you need to be popular with your shareholders, otherwise you're gone. They can remove you at any time, your company can be bought at any time, and so on. So I think there's a certain tension between the two, and I don't think it's very realistic to believe that statements about wider purpose in a non-binding document have the force to really reverse the legal rules.
Okay, so I just want to, John, do you want to say something?
I'm in a mission-driven organization. We make a lot of money, but that's not why we're in the business. I would say that the issue as a CEO and as a leadership team about dealing with the three problems that Celia described are very similar than if we were a for-profit long-term organization. I mean, it is costly. It's costly in terms of time, energy, and money. It is hard for people. It takes a long time. And as a CEO, you have to relate it, whether it's on your financial statements or in your organization's mission, that you're doing it in order to carry out the organization's goals and mission. If you can't sell that the reason we're doing the culture change is to be successful in our mission, it's not going to work. and everyone's going to say that was a waste of time, and after 2 years you're going to abandon it. So I think that these issues about whether you're selling it to shareholders, whether you're selling it to employees, or even if you can carry it out all the way, because it takes that 5 years just to get some traction. I think these are pretty much common across organizations, not just for the for-profit entities.
So I have to apologize that I've been showing positional bias because my chair has me facing this way. So I'm just going to shift a little bit. Norman, Lord Blackwell, you had a question?
Yeah. I'm struck, Norman Blackwell, Lloyds Bank. I'm struck by the fact a lot of the initial conversation was around culture to avoid ethical misbehavior. In retail banking, I think while that was a problem, I think increasingly, we've moved on, and the issue now is about more how to build a culture that does really positive things for customers and employees. And the problem definition we have is that banks, retail banks in particular, are driven around processes that were centralized and industrialized 20 years ago or more because of the compliance risk and the risk of failures, and therefore autonomy and thinking was taken out of the organization by processes that became very rigid and rule-driven. Now which meant people couldn't actually respond very well to customers who didn't fit the norm or situations. Now technology is removing a lot of the simple clerical stuff, and we actually need people who can think and who can respond to customers and who can take the initiative to deal with the vulnerable customers, to deal with the customers who don't. But all the systems drive that behavior out because people are afraid to stick their head up to do something that isn't in the rule book. And that's a huge cultural challenge. So my question to the panel really is, there are lots of levers the chief executive could pull, all the normal levers in an organization, structure, incentives, rules, etc. But the trouble is most of them just fall into the old ways of behavior and take a long time to impact. Celia talked about microcells. Is there, do you have observations about examples or ideas of how, if you were a chief executive of a retail bank, how you could use behavioral science to reach down the organization and galvanize all those microcells to start doing things differently?
I think narratives and storytelling are actually really powerful. So one of the things that I think, well, you wouldn't have to do the work, but senior leaders can do is tell people to access the stories of really great microcultures, and then, and because I don't like comms, but communicate them throughout the bank so they become part of the narrative structure of the organization. I was working with a bank about 3 or 4 years ago, and they talked about one particular branch that was quite remote, that where the quantitative metrics about customer service, blah, 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 were wonky, because people were taking way too much time, but they had great customer service retention, or I can't remember what the conflation of them was. And when they went to the branch, it was really a function of this one branch manager who was so sort of passionate about his local community that he had like gifts from all the local people who he'd helped get mortgages for, or he helped work through the system so that he could support the local community. And stories like that, like, this is valuable. I know this doesn't match all of the things that we told you to do, and you might not even meet the standards that we want you to meet on certain metrics, but this is actually who we want you to be. So finding those stories and communicating them in a credible way, I think is a powerful step that you might take.
Stories are good. Grace, yeah.
I would really like to see firms revamp the way that they distribute resources to their talent within organizations. So within a lot of organizations that I know of, there's a lot of money for the young people coming in, and there's a lot of money for the emerging leaders that are picked out, and a lot of money for senior leadership at the top. And the mid-level manager does get forgotten about, but these are the change makers. And I think giving your mid-level manager a behavioural science toolkit for inclusion, not so that your team members feel comfortable whistleblowing when bad things occur, but a toolkit that allows them to get everybody within that team speaking up, everybody within that team being the most creative, being the most innovative. And I think if you get that right, people will naturally speak up and naturally be whistleblowing. But that experience that people have when they're going through that training for the mid-level manager is actually quite empowering. So really refocusing at that level of the organization and seeing them as change makers rather than people that suffer from permafrost. And I've heard lots of other expressions along that way. I really think that will pay dividends.
Sometimes you just need to give people, again, it gets back to language. There's a baseball term, left field, that people use in America. You say, this is coming from left field. I've spent a career saying that in meetings, and then it lets you say anything. And it just, sometimes it's just that kind of trick. We have somebody here, someone up there, but I want to give, and actually lots of other people, this is an education, so can we bring the microphone around? Thank you. Oh, there's one here, okay, right here. But this is an educational institution. I know we have some students here, so after these two questions, we'll try to keep things fairly pacey. I'd like hands from a student. I'd like to hear from one of you. And then I may also turn to our friends from the press and see if you have a relevant question. You may want to ask anything, of course, but you're not going to do that. You're going to ask something relevant. But yes, over here first.
Hi. My name is Zaira Jasser. I'm an assistant professor at Sussex University Business School. And I actually study process of management in the financial industry. I used to be a banker in my previous life. So one of the things that keeps on coming up when I look at leadership processes, and some of the processes I look at are processes of voice. So how voice transitions from the bottom side of the organization to the top is this issue with structure. And by structure, I mean hierarchy, and it's already come up. But I would actually say, and I would like to hear from people as well that study other industries. In the financial industries, the structure and the hierarchy is also represented by materiality. If you go to Canary Wharf or to New York, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? These banks are very tall. They're made of marble and steel, right? So materiality also gives us a sense of culture. So there is a strong, and often executives have separate lifts than the rest of the employees.
I'm sorry?
Separate, elevators. Lifts. In some places, this is the way it works. Also, materiality regards the incentive system. So the diversity between what a junior person earns or a middle person earns and the top people earn is huge. So there is an issue of status. So I always, and I worked in this place for 15 years, so I kind of know what I'm talking about. In the sense that I've experienced these things. So I'm wondering whether radical change is ever possible. Because the structure and the materiality are so embedded, and anyone that studies institutional theory knows what I'm talking about. They're so embedded that it's very difficult to achieve radical change without some structural radical change. So it's a bit of a provocation, and it would be, nice to hear.
Any comments in response?
Well, just a quick observation. I mean, I don't know the answer to your question, but one of the things that I find interesting over, the last couple of years, or even more than the last couple of years, over the last decade maybe, actually I think probably for a lot of people the faster way to get wealthy is with Silicon Valley, right? And so now actually you see some banks advertising, for new jobs, saying, well, you can go to Silicon Valley and make a lot of money there, or you can do, finance some whatever project it is and help, the economy grow. And so banks have actually shifted, at least in their recruiting, to, Silicon Valley used to be do the good thing until people figured out, well, mostly you're coding, maximizing ad revenue, and I don't know how valuable that is to society. So now financial institutions seem to have shifted and say, well, you could do that, or you could do something socially valuable at a bank. So maybe there is a little bit of a shift, at least in how banks are marketing themselves.
Okay, thank you for that. I've totally changed my bias here and addressed it. We're going up to this side.
Andrew Keckwick, consultant. Which aspects of behavioural science are relevant to persuading managers that it may take, for example, more than 3 months to change an organisational culture, and how to persuade managers to implement the other excellent and well-tried recommendations for cultural change that have been made?
By showing examples, right? So I think a lot of change happens because of dyadic relationships. I'm lucky enough to work with a great organization that has great relationships with organizations that are willing to do the long-term experiments. And now that we have sort of the end of the first stage of a first major intervention, now we can move forward and say, like, this is what it takes, this is how long it will take, but this is the type of change that you can expect. So I think precedent is the way to persuade people of that.
Okay, so I've been down this road. We did the full 5 years. So here's the lessons I take away from that, which I was told beforehand by Rich Lyons. We had the dean of the Haas Business School in Berkeley. He said these are basically the same three things. You're going to need to understand. This is so. First is you got to get some wins. You really do need to deliver something along the way. So we always talk about low-hanging fruit or something, but there's got to be a sense by people that this is actually getting traction and making a difference in some tangible way. So it is a long-term project, but if you can find some things along the way that are real within a year or two, I think that makes a big difference in terms of people buying in. So I think that's the first. Now I know you said you were kind of no on comms and things. I actually do think that as long as you're doing all the other things right, consistent communications is really important. So the thing that's been hard for me, being an economist, I always came to the view that if you say something 3 times, you're boring people. Well, in this, no. You have to say it over and over and consistently, and it has to be tone at the top matters a lot. Tone at the second tier matters a lot. Getting that at the third, fourth, and then to your point, getting that into the middle to the middle levels of management is really critical. But I think when we tell this story. We say this is going to be a multi-year. I always use my Star Trek comparison. This is going to be a 5-year mission and things like that. That's being honest with people, but you also have to show some results that people feel. And then when they get that, then they're kind of more willing to buy in and see it. And also, I think, in fact, you're actually kind of making change happen, and people are excited about it. People are afraid of change. But people also get excited when they see things are happening that helps them do all the things that you were talking about. Being empowered, being able to do their best work, be challenged. I mean, all of these things, I think, come together nicely.
So do we have a student? And then we'll go over here to the press. Do we have any student?
Right in the middle.
Hi, I'm Donna Carmichael. I'm a PhD student here at the LSE. So we've heard a lot about some of the organizational level factors that determine culture, the tone at the top, what behaviors get condoned or ignored, who gets rewarded and promoted. But I would argue that certainly for public corporations, the idea of the shareholder primacy is a much more potent and powerful force than any of us are acknowledging here. And if you look at the countless examples over the years of CEOs making unethical decisions, kind of not taking an ethical stance because the share price will get pummeled and they will suffer. I think that we are kind of fooling ourselves by believing that there is a change in culture. The Business Roundtable saying, yes, the purpose of a corporation is not just Milton Friedman's maximizing shareholder returns. As Edmund said, that's a non-binding document, and there have been lots of organizations stating, yes, we need to change. I think it's largely in response to this massive inequality issue we face in the world today. So I would challenge all of us, I guess, and especially the panel, to think more at the higher level in terms of the political economy of organizations and how shareholder value determines so much of the decision-making in organizations and the culture in organizations. So I just challenge you to think about that.
I think that's a very good challenge, actually. Thank you. So does the audience. We had a question here from the press. Or? Behind you was the first hand. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Brian Swint from Bloomberg News. Kind of following on from that, I'm just wondering, listening to this, is improving corporate culture something that governments can legislate? Can you affect good change? And related to that, is the disincentive of managers or executives going to jail, for example, and when you have a crisis like the banking crisis of a decade ago or LIBOR scandal, is that an effective disincentive or an incentive to improve culture?
I'll start, and I know others will want to dive in. I think there is something about different about the financial services industry on this. And a lot of regulation that we think of publicly traded corporations or more generally is really in the regulatory remit. And maybe this is where the lawyers and economists have a slightly different view, which tends to be about here are the rules. As long as you follow the rules, that's okay. And then if there's an investigation and you break a rule, there's some kind of consequences of that. In the banking sector, the regulated banking sector, it's the supervision model. At least I'm speaking now in the U.S. context. And supervision model is actually a different model of what success looks like. And supervision is supposed to be proactive. I forget who brought up this thing about whether using technology or more generally about identifying things before they become the problem. That's what supervision is about, identifying when issues are growing or maybe risk management is losing track of things. So I think in the supervision context, which the goal is you catch things before they became a big problem, whether it's a regulatory problem or a safety and soundness problem or maybe a consumer protection problem, that you catch them early and help, and basically management resolves that. And so that's like the definition of success. I think in that world of supervision, culture kind of issues play right into that. Because why? Because culture is really connected to risk management practices. It's related to governance between the board of directors, the senior management, and other things. So I do think that, at least from my perspective, in the supervisory kind of world, these culture issues are much more closely connected to how it works. I think outside the banking sector, you're more in this kind of regulations, which is a little bit different. I'm not as familiar with.
So I am looking at my infamous watch. Very quick question, if you could, and that will probably be the last one, and then I'll just close things.
Thank you so much. This is Sophia Ferber from S&P Global Market Intelligence. In a nutshell, I just wanted to ask you all if you think that the financial services industry is paying enough attention to cybersecurity from a behavioural and cultural standpoint, as well as from a technological standpoint. I ask this because there's been obviously a huge hack of TravelX in the past week, and there have been some suggestions that there was quite a big sort of cultural and process component to that, as well as the technological prowess of the hackers. Thank you.
I'm not going to speak to a specific incident or issue, because I don't think that's really what the point of this is. I do think when you think of cybersecurity, which is critically important for the financial services industry, the health care industry and everybody, and critically important for us. I mean, the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or other central banks, we're processing trillions of dollars of payments and doing all that. So this is a super high priority. I do think culture actually interacts with this enormously. So when I look at my own organization, the idea that you have to do things differently, approach our work differently, use data differently, actually, literally, how do you work in the workplace around this is what's going to make our cyber security improvements be successful or not. It's not purely a technology issue. It's not just getting the right software or hardware. It's really about changing the culture and mindsets in an organization. I think that applies to the industry as well.
I would just add to that from a technology point of view, we've been ignoring very clear insights from behavioral science for years and years. In big organizations with billions of pounds of revenue, employees are asked to change their passwords every 30 days or so, even though everyone knows that means they increment by one and it adds absolutely nothing to security. They have password and email policies that just don't work. And I think there is this interaction with culture where in the right culture, it's probably easier to say, yes, everyone is doing that, but I've asked experts, there's research on this is complete nonsense, let's try to do things differently. But in order to do that, you need to have the right culture at the kind of mid-level, but also the right interest from the top level to bring something up that is as boring as this without being kind of branded the boring nerd.
So I think thumbprints and facial recognition are a great step forward in this space, but I'm afraid we're going to have to pull the proceedings to a close. I really apologize, including a few people I know, that I didn't get to your question, but let me just take a minute to try to draw this together, which actually is pretty much impossible. I thought it was a really interesting discussion. I took some notes of what I call keepers, just thoughts that I'm interested in, and I'll just read a few of these back very quickly. Culture is the hardest, but it's also the most important element in an organization. Think about the language you use and how language shapes behaviors and culture. Culture evolves all the time. It's not a fixed thing. We can't expect it to be. Environment, whether it's good or bad, makes a huge difference to people and how they behave, and emotions as well. And we mustn't ever lose sight of those elements. They're often pushed to the back as softer things. They're not soft. They're absolutely critical to behavior and to outcomes at the end of the day. And the importance, I think Celia mentioned about agency, needing to stay with the customer or within an organization with a member of staff. We heard a lot of mention of corporate purpose. I would say something very quickly. I have senior board associations with major water company, a very big energy company, and retailer with grocery at its core. And I can tell you, if you speak to people who are basically engineers and they treat water and wastewater and fix, burst pipes, this is not the most elegant of jobs they have, but you speak to them in a water company and you kind of say, what do? They will say first, more frequently than not, they will say, our job is to, or my job, they'll say, is to make sure that we can provide plentiful and safe water for the people that we serve. That's the purpose. An energy company has this catchphrase, keep the lights on. That's a purpose. And I think that's an area that needs to be teased out because those purposes relate to people. They relate to life. In groceries, people who deal with food talk the same way about the people who take and eat and consume the food that they deal. So there's something in there that we could possibly think about. And we heard tone from the top. I think a group of 30 report I read, I think it was there some years ago, which was looking at the tone from the top, the importance of that, but actually the equal importance of the echo from the bottom. And that phrase has stuck with me. I think that's hugely important. It's a lot of what we're actually talking about. We explored conformity and groupthink and how everybody wants to feel happy and good, but actually the importance of difficult conversations and challenge and facing into something that's a bit hard, because at the end of the day when you do that, and we find this with our BSB work, that boards, our member boards will hear findings they don't really want to hear, but actually they've been so good so often and face into it, and that really does make change, and then they feel much better about the organization because they feel that they know something. The whole area of accidents and rule breaking and what becomes the norm and what doesn't was of interest. Heard something about the value of work. But who defines that value? Because is it just shareholder value or is it other value? And I think that's something that needs to be focused on further. A lot of comment about the use of data, big data, and machine analytics that we wouldn't have had in the past, and how that can be put to good use, maybe not so good use as well. But that's an important point. Organizational culture is constantly changing, kind of like that view through the kaleidoscope I mentioned. Communications are essential. But the understanding that's needed for the people who run any organization of what's going on beneath them, it will never filter up to it will never get up to the top, and you need another way to do it, which we think is something that the BSB assessment does, and there are other ways to go and do that as well. The notion of capturing stories, there's probably nothing more important than having some stories, some corporate stories that can be spoken about. And I think I will close there, but leave you with an Irish proverb that I love, which is, may you have the hindsight to know where you've been, the foresight to know where you're going, and the insight to know when you're going too far. That may be something about culture as well. Two things to ask of you. The first is, when we finish, which we're just about to do, could you please stay in your seats, and I'll ask the panel to go up to the back of this auditorium, or this theater, because we have tea and I assume some biscuits, and you'll be able to catch some of them there and talk to them, but we don't want them mobbed on the way out, so if you could just sit until they go up the aisle. And then the final thing is, could I ask you to join me in thanking some really interesting people, and John, and just giving your views from a wonderful position, but all of you as well. I thought this was absolutely terrific. I have lots more to ask people, but can we join us?